Today's Imprint Weekly podcast is brought to you by Accenture. Change is afoot in child welfare. Change that means agencies focus on results for children and keep far more of them safe at home with their own families. Accenture's child welfare team is leading the way in the effort to ensure technology does its part in that success story. Accenture offers cutting-edge case management tools that ensure agencies can see insights that drive decision-making and caseworkers have information they need at their fingertips. Together, these tools help agencies stay laser-focused, reinventing child welfare into a source of strength for families when they need it. For more information, visit www.accenture.com/childwelfare.
Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters, and for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. On this week's podcast, Mira Zimet joins us to talk about the Storyboard Project. She's going to discuss the project since she founded it in 2014. We'll focus a little bit on her recent third season of profiling current and former foster youth around the country. Before we get to a few headlines for the week, I wanted to give a quick plug for a really great project that the organization Break Free Education does each year at this time. They recruit people to write holiday cards to youth who are currently incarcerated around the country. So if you're interested in helping them out with that, the process is very easy. There's no mail involved. It's all electronic on your end. I'm going to drop the link to register into the show notes to this episode, but here it is verbally. It's breakfree-ed.org/care-mail. So breakfree-ed.org/care-mail. It's a really awesome thing that they do every year. So I definitely encourage people to sign up, and you should do that pretty quickly because they do have to get those in and send out before the holidays. All right, let's do a few quick headlines for the week, starting with a string of interesting stories produced by our reporters here at the Imprint. As always, all of these stories I'm going to mention will be included in our show notes if you want to read up. First is by Annie Shiaka, reporting on the fact that 2 Texas girls living in a makeshift shelter for youth in foster care without an actual placement were sexually assaulted in October. Now, 2 men have been arrested for the alleged assaults, and the alleged offense was reported and the arrests were reported in October by the website dailytrib.com. They are out of Burnett County, Texas. But the fact that these were girls that were unplaced in foster care, living in one of Texas's several child without placement or CWAP facilities, that had not been reported until we did it so last week. This news comes out in the same week that the state's child welfare leader, Jamie Masters, was fired by Governor Greg Abbott. I'm going to link everybody to Roxana Asgharian of the Texas Tribune story on this, which highlights the fact that Abbott had sent former Director Masters, a well-known child welfare expert named Ann Helligstein. She was on loan from Casey Family Programs to serve as a deputy at the Department of Family and Protective Services there in Texas. Also had sent over an experienced bureaucrat, Julie Frank, to be her chief of staff. And then Masters sent both women away in October. So fast forward a month and a few days after that, she was gone. In announcing that Stephanie Muth would soon succeed Masters in the job, Abbott also noted that Helligstein would be returning to help out and continue to serve as deputy under Muth. Philadelphia has started an ombudsperson's office specifically for youth who are detained or placed into group settings like group homes, shelters, and other residential care facilities frequently experienced, particularly by older youth in foster care. And this office will be housed within the City Inspector General's office, not the Department of Human Services, which is something that both the youth and advocates who are pushing for this to get underway had been adamant about. So this was kind of 2 years in the making. The city council had allocated money, I think as far as 2 years back, to do this, but ultimately it needed Mayor Jim Kenney to, establish an executive order authorizing the office, and now it's underway. Certainly not the first Ombuds office. We've reported on plenty of them in the Imprint. Often they are on the state level, but it is interesting that this one is local and it's housed in a place with a mandate to invest wrongdoing, and that it's very targeted at residential care, where the city and state have had some pretty high profile debacles here in Pennsylvania. Just a few that come to mind: the Glen Mills schools problems with abusive behavior there, exposed by great journalist Lisa Gartner, who has been on the podcast before. Lisa also reported on some serious issues at Devereaux, which is another residential care provider with a lot of space in Pennsylvania. And Philadelphia youth named David Hess recently was killed at a residential program called Wordsworth in a fight that stemmed over his use of a cell phone. Then a third Imprint story from last week worth taking a look at. Nancy Marie Spears, who is our Indigenous Children and Families reporter, broke some research news last week for some really interesting numbers on the provision of childcare on college campuses. Findings published by Child Trends, which is a well-known evaluation and research firm in this space, last month, show that tribal colleges and universities do way better in guaranteeing access to child care on campus when compared to other institutions. And honestly, it's not even really close. According to the data, 43% of tribal colleges and universities provide child care. That is compared to 21% of other degree granting institutions. So that's definitely worth a read. In addition to reporting on the findings, Nancy talked to Nicole Alkier Grady, who is a sophomore at Sitting Bull College currently, about how critical the access to childcare has been for her. The governor of South Carolina, Henry McMaster, has asked a U.S. District Court for summary judgment in a case called Rogers v. Department of Health and Human Services, which is centered on South Carolina's continued partnership with a group called Miracle Hill Ministries. It's a Protestant-affiliated organization that recruits and licenses and trains foster parents. They also do work directly with youth, but will only do so for couples that share the organization's religious ideology. Now, it's not completely connected to this case, but South Carolina is also one of about a dozen states that has a law to protect faith-based child welfare providers from so-called adverse consequences in contracting in grants for following their ideology. So in other words, in the states that have these laws, no state could pull a contract or cancel a grant to a child welfare provider simply because they decided they would follow their faith and ideology in deciding who to serve. Now, before South Carolina passed that law, Miracle Hill actually had gotten a direct waiver from the Trump administration, so they were in a unique position of being able to follow their religious ideology while under that waiver gaining access or eligibility for federal money. A few things jumped out at me in this filing that I thought were kind of worth mentioning in this context, because I think they may relate to further battles in court over these issues. First, the filing claims in arguing that the lawsuit is moot that Miracle Hill does not receive funding from the state or the federal government, which is really confusing since this all started really with this federal waiver that the Trump administration gave to Miracle Hill to allow federal funds for this group. And as recently as 2019, a news outlet called religiousnews.com reported that Miracle Hill had brought in $600,000 of its annual budget in state and federal money for foster care services. So if it is actually the case that they are not a recipient of any taxpayer dollars, I'm not sure what the point is here for a court process, because organizations in other states have done plenty of foster parent recruitment services without taxpayer dollars. There's an organization in Arkansas called The Call, who at last I checked does not receive a dime of money from Arkansas or the feds, and they are responsible for recruiting a healthy percentage of the couples that end up becoming foster parents in Arkansas. Second thing in the filing, there's an argument made here that the Supreme Court's Fulton v. City of Philadelphia ruling from 2021, which we talked about quite a bit on the podcast when it happened, and I'll link folks who don't remember this to some stuff if you want to check our show notes. Basically, in this filing, the claim is that Fulton v. City of Philadelphia requires the state to accommodate Miracle Hill Ministries. And That is simply not true as I understand the decision in Fulton v. City of Philadelphia, which was a unanimous ruling. So all the liberal and conservative justices signed on to the same side of it. And it really focused in on a very specific aspect of cities and states working with faith-based child welfare groups. I don't want to get into the weeds here too much, but essentially what that case came down to is that the city of Philadelphia has a non-discrimination clause or requirement that providers sign, but there's a waiver ability that grants the city's commissioner, the Department of Human Services, to simply just waive that. And this came down to the fact that she did not do so in the case of this faith-based provider. So it was very specific. It was not something that was going to be readily applicable to really any child welfare system that didn't have pretty much exactly the same thing in place, some sort of non-discrimination policy with a built-in waiver that kind of put it in the power in one person's hands to decide when and when not to enforce that. The third and last thing here that I wanted to flag is the governor asserting that, and I'm just going to quote from the filing here, discovery wholly undermined the basic premise of plaintiffs' assertions that they would be disadvantaged if they did not work with one particular agency, Miracle Hill. So it will be interesting to me to see how a federal court reacts to that argument and that line of reasoning, because I think that you could see that going to be in play if and when, these state laws protecting faith-based groups from adverse actions ever gets challenged up the ranks of federal court, possibly even to the Supreme Court someday. Because on the one hand, perhaps it is true in today's South Carolina, it seems that there are certainly arguments that the discovery shows this. It is the case that several private providers exist that contribute to recruiting, training, and supporting foster parents and youth without discriminating in their policies. What the governor's office argues is that, in fact, Miracle Hill is the only one that does. On the other hand, there's really nothing that would prevent McMaster's administration from only choosing to work with and contract with faith-based providers in the future, which is admittedly just a theoretical or a hypothetical as opposed to the current state on the ground. And that would create a landscape where it is definitely hard to find a path to fostering if all or most of those providers are of the same religious bend, if you do not happen to be of that religious bend. But the governor also points out that even if that was the case, right, and all the private providers were discriminatory, he doesn't use that phrasing, the state is still open for business, right? So the state could just license a foster and adoptive parents. You don't need to go through a private provider or nonprofit or whatever to go and get licensed and trained up. Now, that in theory might be true. What people will tell you on the ground is that it is extremely difficult to go through the process of getting to completion in becoming a licensed foster parent or adoptive parent, and doing so without the help of somebody other than, a state office that is probably overburdened with a lot of stuff and may not be that responsive. The only person helping you is that office. Anyway, it's going to be an interesting decision when this all plays out, because there really has not been a lot of action in terms of challenging states with these laws. And I think how the federal courts or the district court in this case takes the arguments made by McMaster could be telling, maybe even help shape and sharpen some of the arguments, on both sides as people prepare for this to be, basically one of the next big legal battles around child welfare in the courts. Lastly, for this week, a couple of researchy things to call out here. I thought the Annie Casey Foundation's recent brief on juvenile diversion was a pretty interesting and kind of easy to digest look at pretty critical issue here. Just looks at the racial patterns and trends in diversion based on recent national data, and shows that in the past decade and a half, the gap on cases diverted has widened between Black and white youth. So in 2005, 49.4% of white youth's cases were diverted from juvenile court, and 41.2% of Black youth's cases were. Fast forward to 2019, that delta was 51.6% of white kids' cases getting diverted and 39.7% for Black youth. So as always, it's important to point out that the pie has gotten much smaller. There's way, way lower numbers of arrests of youth of any race or creed. There's way less youth in general who get detained or incarcerated. But as that's happened, and there has been for that entire period of time a federal requirement for states to seek solutions to reduce disproportionate minority contact, the gaps have widened on things like diversion. And as we will talk about in a podcast episode next year with the great Melissa Sickman of the National Center of Juvenile Justice, has also widened on the use of detention. It's a good quick read, explores some reasons why the gap exists, and urges systems to reconsider those barriers to more equity on the matter of diversion. So I'll drop a link to that in the show notes, of course. Last thing, we had Justin Hardy and Kristen Ethier on the podcast earlier this year to talk about how little we know and what we need to study about fathers in foster care, young men who are parenting while in the system. Now, the same holds true for fathers of youth in foster care. They are often ignored in the conversation about the system and what to do differently or better. In late October, the Administration for Children and Families released a design report that indicates that we will be getting perhaps some quality information on 5 different systems that have been experimenting with different ideas, policies, and practices around the inclusion and support of fathers in child welfare cases. So those 5 areas are Los Angeles County in California, Hartford and Manchester in Connecticut, Denver and Prowers County in Colorado, and then Wake County, North Carolina. According to the report, the work is expected to wrap up in March of 2023, and then we'll see some findings in the calendar year on this. So we will keep our eye on it here at the podcast, maybe have a guest come in to talk a little bit more about it. All right, when we come back, our interview with Mira Zimet of the Storyboard Project. It's that time of year where nonprofit journalism organizations are looking to maximize giving through the annual News Match campaign, and we are no exception. If you enjoy this podcast or the great work our reporters do at the Imprint and at Fostering Families Today, please consider making a donation. And if you do so this month or in December during News Match, your donation will get doubled. Fostering Media Connections is very lucky to have some terrific philanthropic supporters, advertisers, sponsors, subscribers, but we really cannot do it without donors like you who read our stuff, listen to our podcasts, and attend our online events. There are tons of really great nonprofit independent news outlets to support out there, and we hope you consider us one of them. To give today, it is easy. Visit imprintnews.org/donate. That's imprintnews.org/donate. We are joined today by Mira Zimet, founder of the Storyboard Project. It's a short documentary web series created to lift up stories of youth who have experienced foster care. We will talk about how it all started, what viewers can expect from the most recent season, and more. Mira, thanks for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Podcast rules, they got to know something about you first before we get into the weightier conversation. So, Mira Zimet, you got to give me at least one of your favorites. The categories are movie and TV show, sports team, book, and or musical group. Got to give me at least one. Can give me more. What do you got?
Okay, I'm going to say movie, Silver Linings Playbook, but I'm going to say book, and it kind of leads into the conversation, but it's The Language of Flowers by Vanessa Diffenbauer.
What is that book about? I've heard of it, but I don't know it.
It's about actually a youth who's transitioned out of the foster care system at 18, and how she uses her knowledge of flowers to kind of, integrate herself and meet people. So it's really showing that kind of that transitional age and what it's like.
So the Storyboard Project is your passion project, right? Not your main gig, but you've worked for a long time with the University of Southern California's wonderful journalism school, who the Imprint has plucked a few people from over the years, the Annenberg School, right? That's sort of been your career to the side of your passion.
Yeah, well, my career started doing freelance video for years, documentaries, freelance. I started at USC in 2008, started actually at the college, and then moved over to Annenberg about 5-6 years ago, where, Daniel Hempel, there's definitely some people who come out of Annenberg who are amazing.
Yeah, Daniel Hempel, who is our founder of the Fostering Media Connections organization, and what was then the Chronicle of Social Change, now the Imprint. Also, Sarah Tiano, shout out to Sarah Tiano. She's on her maternity leave with her second child, but she is one of our great reporters. So you're back to indie, right? You've hung out your own shingle now.
Yes, correct. That is true.
Very cool. What are you working on other than what we're about to talk about today? You got any fun projects?
Just some writing
Yeah.
and for different organizations, nonprofit, did some work for a place called Home, and also doing some videos for different organizations. So just
Nice.
a little bit of that. But the Storyboard Project is my main gig, and it's what I'm excited to be working on. And one of the reasons why I decided to kind of transition out.
Got it. Well, let's talk about that then. So 2014 is when I remember the Storyboard Project coming into my life, at least, because we at the time had featured some, or I think even all of the first season on what was then the Chronicle of Social Change, now was the Imprint. So I knew about it in 2014, but when did this seed get planted in your head to do this? Like, tell me the origin story of how you decided to do this storyboard project.
I think I love reading. So I think, and it takes me into different worlds. So actually, one of the first books I read about it was White Oleander by Janet Fitch. And that was like in the early 2000s. And at that point I was doing some documentaries, and I thought, wow, this would be a great story to do, talking about transitional foster youth, but I just wasn't ready yet. And then kind of cut to the end of around 2011, then read The Language of Flowers. I'm like, this is still here. This is still part of something that I know I want to do something with. And then was at the college at that point. We were doing a big celebration, and I ended up having the chance to work with some of the students who were going to be speaking at the celebration. And one of the students was a former foster youth. And we just kind of clicked, became friends. I kind of even said to her, do you have something to wear? It's like a big gala, and took her and got her something, and just kind of took her to lunch and just got to know her over a few years. And then I was at a point where I said, I've been doing video for over 20 years or so. I wanted to find a way to give back. I know part of The Language of Flowers was mentorship, but I thought, what can I do? And so I thought, well, I have this video skill. And at that point, there were a few video projects like It Gets Better about the LGBTQ community. And there was a few others. And I thought, well, what if I actually use my skills to interview, kind of prompt and work with transitional foster youth and give them a chance to tell their story, to have a voice that they may or may not have had. And I talked to Jasmine, and actually she had introduced me to another young man, and they're like, I think that's a great idea. So that's kind of how it evolved. And then I talked to some people at USC, and they actually introduced me to Daniel, and he and I talked about it. And that's how that kind of evolved into taking some of the stories and doing some write-ups and putting them on at that point, the Chronicle of Social Change.
So when did you actually get started? What was like the first interview you recorded? Was it right around 2014? Did it take, it was pretty quick to the first release?
It was right.
Wow.
I started it, did all the paperwork. And at that point it was a sole proprietorship. And then in 2019, I ended up becoming a 501c3. But at that point, and I'm trying to rack my brain, but I just kept putting feelers out, but it was surprisingly easy. I just kind of started to know some people and then asked them who they knew. And I was an organization in Hollywood, and I went and talked to them, and they introduced me to a young woman, and she was my first story. And, it really took off from there. There was an event at USC. Just again, I don't know, these are all coincidences or all, serendipitous, but with the Right Way Foundation, who's another organization in LA. And the Right Way Foundation was there. And I just introduced myself when I said, would you like me to work with you and do a video? And so I actually did a video for them, and did some stories on a couple of their youth. And Daniel and another person introduced me to Zaid Gale, who's at Peace for Kids. And so I got very involved with Peace for Kids. I was first a volunteer, and then I'm on the board now. And a lot of their stories, work with them to tell their youth stories, and just another way, again, to tell, to kind of authenticize and tell these stories.
I'm sure this has evolved over time as you've worked with more young people on these, but I'm just curious in general, when, an organization, or I'm sure there's a lot of word of mouth about you, especially in California now, like Myra is the woman who does these vignettes, right? These stories about foster youth. But when you actually get one-on-one with a youth who is considering letting you tell the story, really giving you the honor of doing that, how do you communicate about this to them? Like, what do you make sure they know? Like, how do you make sure, it's a comfortable situation in both directions?
One of the things that I'm really clear on in the beginning is that it's their story. And so that's the first thing I convey to them. The nice thing about not working for an organization is that there's no agenda. I don't have a thing where, oh, well, you need to cry here or you need to pitch this. It's like, this is your story. I let them know that as the edit goes on, when it's done, they will see it. It will not go up until it's approved. There have been youth who, have a conversation with me and then afterwards say, oh, I wish I hadn't said that. And I'm like, no problem. It goes out. And, it's my way of kind of honoring them, and I know people have said, well, they're telling me their story and there's often a lot of trauma in the story. And so what I know though, is that while, sometimes I'll be sitting there listening to them and there'll be tears in my eyes, I still know that I'm listening to them and I'm being present for them. And to me, that's what makes it helps me to make sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally get that. Like, I differentiate what you do from like a documentary, because what you just described, right? If you're taking things out of a documentary, if you're like so many documentaries, the negotiation about access is upfront. It's like, if I'm going to do this, I really need to see you. I need to be there for everything. And we got to tell the story on what all happened. And I view your project as an opportunity for a young person. Essentially, you're asking, what do you want the world to know about you and your experience, right? And so it's in that way, it makes complete sense that they have that control, in working with you on it.
And it's oddly kind of evolved. Like when I started, I didn't have any idea what it was going to be. But what ends up happening is we start out kind of, what's the childhood? When did you first go into foster care? What, how many homes were you in? And they choose how much information they want to give. I may prompt them with a few questions, and I always tell throughout, it's your comfort level. You share whatever you want to share. And there's something I want to add about that in a minute. But there's always this moment, and it just seemed to evolve where what was the thing that was an organization, a person, sometimes it was faith, that got you from kind of this traumatic childhood into whatever your idea, whatever success means to you, whether it's working, whether it's school, whatever that looks like, that you are, have moved forward in your life. And that to me is this nugget that I'm hoping people who are watching it, certainly youth, can say, well, they had, just as, or, a childhood that I did, but they let somebody in. They let a guidance counselor in, or they let a teacher in, or they let an organization, in, and now look where they're at. And I think that to me is kind of the message and so it's always growth. It's always not just staying in whatever happened. It's like, where am I now? And honoring that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. I've always wondered this in watching them. You keep them so tight, they're usually between like 3 and like 6 minutes for the most part. How much tape do you get on any one of those young people in the interview? Like, how long what do you start at to get down to 5?
They're like an hour to an hour and a half. It is a lot of work, and it's just finding the gems, and because people do tend to repeat themselves, but sure. It's like, and I'm also, and that's what I say, I strategically edit. So I'm also, as a parent and also as an employer, they may say something I'm not putting in the video. You know what I mean? And if there's things that I'm on sure of, then we'll have a conversation about it, but they're young, they're in their 20s. A lot of kids are just, yeah, that's no problem. You can talk about this. But if it has to do with any kind of gangs or things like sometimes, oh, I stole some food or whatever it is that felt like nobody needs to know that, it's not part of your story. I go in terms of when they talk about abuse, sometimes it's just generic. And sometimes if it feels like that it's necessary to the story, we'll talk about how much to include. But I'm not trying to, and once we say you were in foster care, once we say you're neglected, I don't need to have all the details. I don't think anybody needs to have the details. So it's just a matter of it needs to be there for the story.
How many, so you have done 3 seasons now since 2014. How many total episodes? How many are up there?
I'd have to count. I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's okay.
I'm going to say there's probably been about 20 or so. Nah, probably 30 or so.
Yeah,
So
I think
I'd have
that's
to count
right.
them and get back to you.
Yeah.
So-
No, that sounds right. I was, in preparing to interview you, I kind of went back and watched a bunch of the old ones just to get a feel for all that stuff.
Oh, I was gonna say, and the thing that ends up is that there's different years. And I think during the pandemic, I think I did one, online, but I think it was just kind of took a break during that. So there was a couple years where I wasn't doing anything, but and just kind of gearing up for where I'm at now. I think that's where, had done a lot. And it's like, okay, what does this look like now?
Yeah. And so, to your point, a lot of the early season young people were in California, though there were there were quite a few in New Jersey and New York and other places. But this season was a little different, right? You took it on the road. There was an Airstream involved. Tell folks a little bit about, how this one played out.
Yeah. So basically my husband and I've thought about kind of doing some traveling for a long time. And we ended up deciding to get an Airstream, but it was just to kind of travel around the country. But to me, it's like this gave me the opportunity to like really reach out, because I have had youth write to me from some youth who've written to me from different states have actually traveled. Like there was a young man from Oregon who actually came to LA. There was a young woman from New York who came to LA. So sometimes the nice thing about living in Los Angeles is people end up sometimes having something to do here, and then we end up doing the story. But in this situation, it just became an opportunity to just really tell stories around the country. So the first thing I did was reach out to you. And because I knew I couldn't just randomly call, organizations and say, hi, love to interview one of your youth. So you were kind enough to give me some connections. And then I also talked to 6-2 Cancel, who I've done some work with in the past. And he connected me with Journey to Success. Journey to Success.
Sure.
Journey to Success is like a policy advocacy campaign, and they're seeking to kind of improve the opportunities and outcomes for youth and young adults who have a foster care experience. And so it just aligned perfectly, because the stories I was telling were aligning with what they wanted to be able to show policymakers, because they want to enact different kinds of changes. So, and then the other thing that I ended up doing while working with them, because they ended up deciding to sponsor, these videos. And so after kind of doing the story, and sometimes part of the story is some of these questions, but really being specific on mental health and wellness, asking those, as an opinion, like, how are you, either for yourself, or how could we do things differently? How could your mental health and wellness been supported better? Or if you had a lot of youth I talked to had a kinship experience starting out that didn't work out, and then they ended up going into the foster care system. And so it's, what could your relatives have been given to have made that successful? And so those are the kinds of questions and answers that hopefully they can use in order to make change.
Yeah, so this season came at it from a little bit more of like an angled question, right? As opposed to the earlier two seasons, like
Well,
what you're describing there.
yeah, I mean, it had the same journey, so that's still part of it. But I think that there was a little bit more specifics in terms of what about family? What about money? What about stuff like that? So I think that I dove a little deeper into some of the questions that are on people's minds right now.
So you start with your Airstream and your husband in tow in California. What was the route? Tell people, like, so where did you go? You don't have to do the whole thing, but where where did you go that you interviewed a youth for season 3?
Sure. Okay. Well, we actually had a destination of Florida because we were meeting family at Disney World. So there was our destination.
Okay.
So we started out and met some youth in Arizona. And then we tried to get to New Orleans, and that kind of didn't pan out. But so we interviewed a few youth in Florida, in Tampa and in Orlando, and then went to Louisville, and then came back and actually was able to get a young woman from New Mexico and a young man from Nevada. So we kind of spaced it out and felt like we got, a nice amount of youth, considering it was like a 5-6 week trip. So
That's quite the circuitous route. And, you mentioned that 6-2 Cancel helped you out with this. 6-2 is the founder and CEO of Think of Us, working to imbue policy and advocacy discussions with the lived experience of young people. In kind of looking back over your work from the first 2 seasons, it really jumped out to me just how many of the young people you interviewed back then are just clear leaders in this field right now. And I'm sure there's some that I'm not familiar with that are doing great in other things, but just, Sixto obviously jumped out. Javon Wilkes, who has written for us, at the Imprint, now working for the California Coalition for Youth. DeMonte Thompson, we just published a really powerful op-ed he did in the wake of that really unfortunate incident with the LA council members. And Casey Getty is a part of another awesome podcast other than ours, Diaries of a Black Girl in Foster Care, is also a policy analyst for the Center for the Study of Social Policy. So that's got to feel good. I mean, these are young people that you interview that have gone on to some pretty stellar stuff in the field.
And they came in different ways. Well, 6'2" I met actually at the end of 2014. So I was on Twitter, and this was, and he tweeted me, or I guess you would say tweeted me. And so we ended up talking, and then he ended up coming out to Los Angeles, and we ended up working together for a number of years on different projects. We worked with iFoster. We worked on bunch of different projects together. At that point, we were looking into kind of more visual storytelling and how are we going to tell these stories. I know some of the stories that we did, he was able to kind of share this experience. I know he still shares them with his team. And so that was just a great, and then he's gone on, as you know, and done amazing things, but we stay connected, and he's obviously amazing. And then it's funny because Akeen, who I met through Peace for Kids, that's how I did his story. And then Casey contacted me through Akeen. So that's how that relationship. And DeMonte went to USC. So I met him through, so all of them, I didn't meet them because of where they are now. I met them just through happenstance of people I knew. So it's a very small community. Javon was the first one I took to dinner. I took Javon and Jasmine, and they're the first two who said, yeah, you should do this. So he's always has a warm place in my heart.
Well, yeah, you deserve some credit because it takes a long time to build up, credibility and word of mouth, I think, in the media space. Like, I still run into people who have not heard of the Imprint, even, in the child welfare space or juvenile justice space, even though we're in it every day. And it's true, like what you're saying is true. I know people that know, like, you're the storyboard lady, and they came to you pretty quickly. It was not you always reaching out to them, right? It's a lot of people found you and said, I want you to tell my story. That's got to feel pretty good.
Yeah. I mean, it was actually funny. I got a text the other day, or not a text, an email from a woman in Colorado. And so she goes, oh, I'd love for you to tell my story. And the first thing I asked them is like, how did you even find me? And, I say it like nicer than that, like, how'd you find me?
Yeah.
And so she was working for an organization, and I forget the name of the organization, but her boss or whatever said, I want you to do some professional development. Why don't you look at some videos on the Storyboard Project? And so it was like, so she did. And then she went ahead and contacted me. And so we're actually planning a trip in the next summer, and we will go through Colorado and we will interview her. So it's just kind of, why not? That's what's so great.
Have you ever thought about doing this on a larger scale and what that would look like? Like, I don't know. I guess the thing I have in my mind is like StoryCorps, or something where people actually, I don't profess to know the inner workings of StoryCorps entirely, but it seems like a bigger national version of what you do would be people recording these stories and then it kind of coming up to you to edit or work on. I just feel like you doing all of them would be tough to scale, right? So have you ever thought about that?
I actually haven't, but I think it's I think that, and maybe this is a telling, but there is the control aspect of it. It's sure. Like, I really try and honor it with like, well, it's a good camera. They're lit. I'm putting video and, so it's kind of like, it would be great if there was a partner who, partner people around the country, but it's also such a sensitive conversation, and so I think that for me, I'm just so like, they're like my babies, it's just like, I just want to make sure that nobody does anything that brings any more harm, if that makes sense, No,
I think it's like fidelity to a model that you've built, right? And
absolutely.
It'd be hard unless you knew, for damn sure that the interviewer is going to be treating the person the way that you would treat them. Yeah.
But absolutely, if there are people around the country who have that same mindset, I would absolutely be interested, because I think it's a great, and there's a lot of kids who want to tell their story, absolutely.
For 2 decades, Fostering Families Today magazine has educated families raising and supporting children and youth in foster care. Delivered in print or online 6 times each year, Fostering Families Today gives families the latest tips, strategies, and research on caring for children with traumatic backgrounds. Use promo code PODCAST5 to save $5 on a print or digital subscription today. Just go to fosteringfamilies today.com/subscribe and enter PODCAST5 to save $5 on your subscription. That's fosteringfamiliestoday.com/subscribe.
So you've done all these interviews with young people that experience the system as older youth, but many of them, also as little kids. Not all of them, but some of them. What are your biggest takeaways after all this work about where the system needs to do better? I know that's a very broad question, and certainly there's not one answer to it, but I'm sure there's something that has just resonated over and over again in the takeaways from these things. What is that?
The only thing is love and believing. I mean, as far as a system, I can't go to the system, but as far as what I'm hearing over and over and over again is that I matter to somebody, that somebody cares about me, and somebody ideally loves me. And I think that, when you hear a young kid says, I don't know why my mom didn't love me, or you hear somebody, the stories of, they just couldn't get out of whatever, let's just say it was drug abuse, like they couldn't get over that. And now I'm in the system because they weren't able to basically deal with their stuff. And when they find somebody, whether it's a mentor, whether it's, sometimes it is a foster parent, in the last few, I found a few where they've had, just a parent who loves them and who really cares about their best interests. And I think that's, I think that's universal. I mean, really, that's all anybody wants is to be seen and loved. And so, if you don't have that in childhood and you don't experience it along the way. So that to me, like I said, the system's a system. And I think that how we get more people, I feel like if there's 400 and some odd thousand youth in the foster care system, and there's how many billion, I don't know how many people in the United States, like how can we not get like somebody who can just, I'm here for you for every, that's not that many youth considering how many, and that all goes to changing the narrative, which is taking a step aside, because if we change the narrative of who is and what is a foster youth, a lot of things we're talking about at Peace for Kids, and obviously a lot of organizations are talking about that. But if we take away the stigma and we take away the media representations of what a youth in foster care is or is perceived to be, then I think more people who care and love. My husband and I have a young woman we brought in, so it's, I don't know. I just feel like it's, that's it.
What do you perceive those stigmas and misperceptions to be? And what do you think that youth in foster care feel, if you think the answer is different?
Well, actually, kind of going back to Peace for Kids, they've been doing a lot of research over the last, 5, 6, 7 years. Actually, I think it's longer than that. And they've done some studies. The studies are basically that many people perceive youth in foster care to be criminals, addicts, victims, things like that. And I think that even if they're shown like the positive stuff about youth in foster care, they still go back to that, and the idea that, and we have media, a lot of the movies that we see, there's a lot of, the crime shows when they're showing a foster youth, they're showing them involved in, in crime and, jail or, sex trafficking so I think that like so many other things that have been happening in our world of late, where we're trying to look at how people are being represented. If we look at how foster youth are being represented, it's just another way to take a look, because you have this whole population of kids who are being, looked at a certain way based on whatever they've seen in the media. When you've got news stories who are, the newspapers who aren't showing the good things and they're only showing the tragedies.
I do agree that the big driving narrative, not that you create, because they are dozens of different interviews, and I don't think you go into it to try and weave them all together, right? But it is that sense of connection as the most important thing. These young people have different experiences that they tell you about. You've got a young person who felt like their experience with residential is very valued. I think a lot of young people would say that was the worst thing they ever experienced. A lot of people talking to you about the importance of their kin, and others who fell out of a kinship placement. I can't remember which young person it was, but it was just, I felt like one of the most moving storyboard pieces was the young man who had, I think, two brothers and a sister who just, they were not in foster care together all that often, but they never, missed that connection and never lost that connection to each other. And I think that comes through more than any one thing as they're talking to you.
Yeah.
My life might not have been the same as a, a kid in a typical family or whatever you want to say, but there were people that mattered to me, that I was connected to, that were super important. And I think there's
Yeah.
a lot of different feelings about the extent to which the system did or did not pay attention to that. I think that was the last question I had for you, was really, what do you find is really important to youth in foster care that maybe policymakers don't pay enough attention to? But I kind of feel like you answered that, because I think that's it, right? Like, it's just not, it's hard to put a policy around just an absolute, fidelity and just like fiendish attention to making sure that if there's a connection to be had, that you just go all out to have it.
You know what's interesting, and it came out in the last few, is the idea that you also listen. It was so interesting because so many so many young people talked about how their foster parent or their biological parent would go to the doctor and say, my kid's misbehaving, they're, have major psychiatric problems. Can you give them medication? And they are given medication based on the parent or the foster parent's diagnosis. And they are not asked any questions. They are not told why. I mean, and I actually ended up talking to some other people about that. And I mean, this is their experience. I don't know. I mean, I'm going to assume this is, there's truth in this because I've heard this before. But I think that so many, and again, it goes to what you just said, connection. If you're listening and if somebody feels that and again, anybody, but if you feel like you're being listened to, and if somebody says, there was one woman who basically came into the country, she was adopted from another country, came here, the adoption didn't work out, was put into foster care, but she wasn't speaking the language. And they took her to the doctor and told the doctor all of these problems she was having. She's like, I wasn't having any of those problems. I was sad. And it's like, but nobody said, well, what's going on? And I think that it goes to all of it. Social workers, I mean, everybody's overworked, but it's like, how do we have 400,000 and we don't have enough people in the world or in the country to just listen and just say, what is going on? And Sixto can talk about this. He's had some of these same, because I did his story as well. And,
Yeah.
And it's just, it's a theme of not being listened to.
That's absolutely right. And I think that specifically the medication thing that you raised is a big one. I mean, we have actually an op-ed, I think will come out sometime in December, from a really experienced doctor who is explaining the ways in which we fail to really properly inform parents, biological parents in particular, about making good decisions and how to do that. But when it comes to older youth who should have that say, we just did our youth voice program, I should say, here at Fostering Media Connections, did a really powerful session with some young women talking about birth control and reproductive health. And it rings entirely true to what you're saying. It wasn't even foisted on them. It was insisted. You are getting on birth control or you can't stay here. I mean, that is, I don't know what to call that. That's beyond what you described, but it is. It's a failure to listen on some level with that.
So it's listening, it's connection, it's love. I mean, that's what I guess, if anything that I want to get through is that all of these are universal. Every single person, most people are looking for connection, right? Love and somebody to listen. And I think that what they're asking isn't that, beyond, I mean, yeah, maybe they're asking, wishing that they hadn't been born into parents that might not have been able to take care of them as they wish they had been, but that's already happened. That ship has kind of sailed. So now what? And I think that now what is, and it's, like I said, I would say in almost every single story that somebody believed in them.
I'm sure you don't have a hard number, but just in general, over these dozens of interviews, how many youth do you feel after talking to them felt like the system did not do enough to actually reunite them with their birth parents or their biological family?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to think. I think that a lot of youth, while they may or may not have wanted to go back to their parents, because some really did say that would have been a good situation. But I think that there were enough that were in some sort of kinship that was working out. And one youth said, maybe they could have just had transportation. They could have helped. There's a lot of doctor's appointments you have to go to. There's reunification at the court you have to go to. There's constantly things that you have to do. And if you can't be a full-time parent, you can't do all of that, so, maybe you're older, maybe you're working. But I think that if there was resources to help grandparents or aunts and uncles, who are taking in, especially younger or, even not younger youth, then that would be, and again, that just goes back to listening. Like, what does the community need? And how could this caregiver be supported? And I don't know why, I think and I'm sure there's people asking those questions, but, the amount of money that people are paying to put a youth in foster care, that money could be used to help, like I said, with transportation, to doctor's appointments, or to whatever youth need to go through to just have all the check marks checked, have all the boxes checked.
Absolutely. So you can, in December, check the Imprint regularly. We will be featuring the new installments of the Storyboard Project. You can also, I would prefer you do that, but you can just skip that if you want and go right to the storyboardproject.com to check it out right now. But I think you should go the Imprint, because we're going to be featuring, kind of Myra's take on each one. It's going to be cool. We'll embed those into our pages. So the storyboardproject.com is where you can check them out, or on the Imprint. Mira Zimet, thank you for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a great conversation.
Thanks to Mira Zimet of the Storyboard Project for joining us today. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of Fostering Media Connections, a California-based nonprofit that publishes the Imprint, Fostering Families Today, and operates the Youth Voice program. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you'd consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. We would really appreciate if you would support our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is super easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. And I might add that if you do so this month, your donation will be doubled as a result of the News Match campaign that we are participating in. You can follow the Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @theImprintNews, and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. And you can always reach us over email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.